hat, a glove, a trail of blood. Investigators believed they led to a killer. The prosecution thought it had an airtight case. Hard evidence, bolstered by rigid science. The defense argued the evidence was tainted and the science was shoddy. The jury expressed reasonable doubt about the guilt of Orenthal James Simpson and serious doubts about forensics. In courts of law and the halls of science, it was the trial of the century. Los Angeles, California. A town famous for sunshine, celebrities, and scandal. But even by LA standards, the events of June 1994 were electrifying. In an affluent suburb, 2 people were found brutally murdered. The prime suspect was a football star turned film actor. All eyes focused on the Los Angeles County Courthouse as the trial unfolded like a Hollywood movie. For 10 months, the state of California versus Orenthal James Simpson played out in the courtroom and on televisions around the world. On October 3rd, 1995, the world held its breath as the jury rendered its decision. It took just under 3 hours to reach its verdict.
We, the jury, in the above entitled action, find the defendant, Orenthal James Simpson, not guilty of the crime of murder in violation of Penal Code Section 187A, a felony upon Nicole Brown Simpson, a human being as charged.
The verdict was a shock to the Los Angeles County District Attorneys who tried the case and to the families of the victims. But for the defense, it was confirmation that the quality of the evidence must be weighed before depriving a person of his freedom. From the start, Simpson was also being tried in the court of public opinion. Though many applauded the verdict, others were stunned. Homicide Detective Tom Lang of the Los Angeles Police Department was one of the men in charge of overseeing the evidence collection at the crime scene.
There are people on death row. Death row. There are people that have indeed been put to death on much, much less evidence, on 1/10 of that evidence.
Defense attorney Barry Scheck was a member of Simpson's dream team and one of the most vocal critics of how the evidence against O.J. Simpson was collected and processed.
The way that crime scene was handled by the criminalists from the Los Angeles Police Department, by the people in the crime lab when they did the initial DNA testing, and by the medical examiner's office was shameful.
Soon after the trial began, it became clear that more than Simpson was on trial. Forensic science would also have its day in court. Could the evidence and the methods under which it was collected withstand the defense team's harsh scrutiny? There were no eyewitnesses to the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and her friend Ronald Goldman. But from the very beginning, the prosecution thought strong circumstantial evidence pointed to the killer. In the Brentwood section of Los Angeles, in the early morning of June 13, 1994, a dog led some neighbors to the front walk of Nicole Brown Simpson's condominium. There lay the mutilated bodies of Nicole Brown and Ronald Goldman. Their killer, or killers, had slit their throats. Bloody shoe prints and drops of blood to the left of them led away from the murder scene toward a back alley. Police believed the prints belonged to someone who'd been bleeding from the left hand as he quit the scene. Also found near the bodies were a blood-soaked glove and a pullover cap. The killer had apparently left them behind. After the crime scene had been secured, the officers called the Homicide Division. Detective Lang received a call at 3 a.m. on the 13th to take charge of the investigation. He arrived at the scene around 4:25 a.m.
The first impression was that it was an overkill, probably some type of rage killing, that there was one killer.
The ground was littered with potential clues. A leather glove, a ski cap, Ronald Goldman's pager, and his car keys, a dog's footprints in the blood, and one set of size 12 shoe prints leading away from the bodies. Detectives had to determine which were important. They started with the blood.
Along with the heel-to-toe stride analysis of the bloody shoe prints, told us that the source was in fact walking. Not what you would expect after committing a brutal double murder. There's an interruption in his gait, and he stops, and there's 2 or 3 prints that point back towards where he was, indicating the possibility that the killer stopped and looked back. Now, when he did that, was he looking, say, hey, I lost my cap, I lost my glove, should I go back and get them? No, I better get out of here, it's very dark down there. So that may have been that hesitation in that stride that we saw in those bloody shoe prints.
At the request of his superior, Lang left the crime scene to notify the victim's estranged husband, former football star and broadcaster O.J. Simpson, that his ex-wife had been killed. He traveled the short distance to Simpson's home on North Rockingham Drive with his partner, Phil Vanatter, and other detectives assigned to the case. One of them named Mark Fuhrman. It was the first time Lang and Vanatter had worked with Fuhrman.
Mr. Simpson, this is the police. Mr. Simpson, this is the police. Will you please open the gate?
They approached the front gate of Simpson's home. Though they could see lights on in the house, no one responded to the buzzer. According to the testimony of Mark Fuhrman at trial, he then noticed a white Ford Bronco outside the gate. It was parked at an odd angle. Through the window, he saw a small black bag bearing the label Orenthal Productions. Fuhrman concluded the car belonged to O.J. Simpson. He then called Tom Lang over to show him something else he had found. Near the door handle on the driver's side, there appeared to be a spot of blood. Lang testified that the detectives feared Simpson was injured and decided to enter Simpson's property to investigate, even though they didn't have a warrant. Fuhrman climbed over the 5-foot wall and let the other detectives in. Lang and Vanatter checked the front door while Fuhrman investigated behind the house. It didn't appear as if anyone was home. Detectives roused Cato Kalin from a bungalow at the rear of the house. Kalin, a guest of Simpson's, wasn't certain of Simpson's whereabouts, but told the detectives he'd heard several loud thumps behind his room earlier that evening. Police later learned that Simpson had left hours earlier for Chicago. While the other detectives continued their search, Fuhrman, alone, went to investigate the cause of the strange noises Kalin reported. He found a bloody glove in plain view. It appeared to match the blood-soaked glove found at the murder scene. Fuhrman brought Vanatter to show him his discovery. Simpson's Rockingham estate was declared the second crime scene of the night. O.J. Simpson was now a prime suspect.
He was not a suspect initially when we went on the property. But once the glove had been found, he most definitely became a suspect.
According to the testimony of Philip Vanatter, as dawn broke over Los Angeles, he was able to see drops of blood in Simpson's driveway. They led from the Bronco to Simpson's house. Later, Vanatter found drops of blood in the entrance hall. As he looked into the Bronco, he saw still more traces of blood on the console and seat. Vanatter ordered the car seized, and by 10:45 obtained a warrant to search the house for additional evidence. Meanwhile, Simpson returned from Chicago. Police had notified him by phone of his ex-wife's murder. He agreed to be interviewed by Detectives Lang and Vanatter without the presence of his lawyer. The detectives noticed a deep cut on a finger of his left hand. Vanatter asked Simpson repeatedly about the injury. His responses seemed inconsistent and contradictory. First, he said he cut his finger in Chicago on a broken glass. Then he changed his story and said he may have cut it in L.A. and reopened it in Chicago. To Lang and Vanatter, Simpson's explanation seemed evasive.
Left-handed, Mr. Simpson?
They began to investigate his whereabouts on the night of the murders.
So you were cutting the knife, cutting the orange then with a knife in your right hand?
Police located the limousine driver who took Simpson to Los Angeles International Airport for his flight to Chicago. He had arrived at Simpson's estate ahead of schedule at 10:25 p.m.
Mr. Simpson?
He testified he didn't see the Bronco and received no answer when he pressed the buzzer at the gate. He then drove around the block and returned shortly before 11 p.m. The driver said at that time he noticed the Bronco parked on the street and saw an African-American male walking hurriedly up the driveway into the house. Then he saw a light go on. O.J. Simpson told him over the intercom that he'd overslept and would be down in a moment. Police believed the murders took place around 10:30. The prosecution felt Simpson's alibi couldn't hold up. They now had to find a motive. To build their case, police interviewed friends and family members of Nicole Brown. They suggested the killing was the final act of a vengeful and abusive husband. Nicole, battered and bruised, had called the police in 1989, charging that Simpson had beaten her.
911 emergency.
Can you get someone over here now to 325 Gretna Green? He's back. Please.
Okay, what does he look like?
He's O.J. Simpson. I think you know his record. Could you just send somebody over here?
Okay, what is he doing there?
He just drove up again.
Just drove
somebody
up.
over.
Okay, wait a minute, what kind of car is he in?
He's in a white Bronco, but first of all, he broke the back door down to get in.
Okay, wait a minute, what's your name?
Nicole Simpson.
Okay.
For his actions, a court ordered Simpson to perform community service. More recently, friends said he'd been stalking Nicole, threatening her and pressuring her to renew their marriage. Nicole had also become concerned about a missing set of keys to her condominium. They would resurface after his arrest.
Days before she was murdered, she told her mother that they were missing and she had thought Simpson had stolen them. And we find them on his person.
Based on the evidence they had collected, the LAPD filed formal charges against Orenthal James Simpson for the double murders. He was scheduled to deliver himself into custody at 11 a.m. on June 17, 1994. When he didn't arrive at police headquarters, the LAPD went to arrest him, only to find he had fled. As they began an extensive search, a television news helicopter began broadcasting images of Simpson and his friend A.C. Cowlings driving along the freeways of Los Angeles in a white Ford Bronco. After driving back to his Rockingham mansion, Simpson surrendered to police. The circumstantial and forensic evidence appeared to confirm Simpson's guilt. The prosecution felt it now had a case that could be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Instead, the case would raise a cloud of doubt about forensic science itself. A week into the investigation of the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman, the LAPD turned its case over to the district attorney's office. Prosecutors, along with the LAPD's Tom Lang and Phil Vanatter, were increasingly confident their case would hold up in court.
Phil and I talk about our last 10 murders combined don't have this evidence. So unquestionably, there's more evidence than that I challenge any prosecutor to tell me they've seen more, unless you've had it in, in Yankee Stadium in front of 80,000 people. I've never seen more evidence or even heard of more evidence in a criminal case than this.
The prosecution accumulated what it felt to be a mountain of evidence. The 2 blood-stained gloves, blood found at the scene, in Simpson's Bronco, and on his clothing, as well as hair found on the knit cap, consistent with that of an African-American male.
This is very important evidence. Circumstantial, yes, but extremely important evidence. What's interesting in this case is every little thing like that ended up in the lap of O.J. Simpson. Nothing was exculpatory. Nothing said someone else was involved or a second person. Nothing says this guy didn't do it.
The trial of O.J. Simpson for the murder of his ex-wife Nicole Brown and her friend Ronald Goldman began in January 1995 in the Los Angeles County Courthouse. Because California state courts allow TV cameras, an audience of millions followed the trial day after day. It was the most watched trial in history. For LAPD detective Tom Lang, this made testifying difficult.
So I'm on the stand, and after all these days, and I've got a jury glaring at me, above them is this camera with 50-some-odd million people watching me live. Am I concentrating on that camera and all these millions of people that I know are watching me, or am I concentrating on the attorney and the questions being asked of me? That's the negative impact that that much publicity can have on a case. And it did play a factor here.
The prosecution would try to prove that O.J. Simpson acted alone, killing Brown and Goldman with brutal efficiency. Brown's blood was found on Goldman and vice versa. To the prosecution, this meant the same knife had been used to kill both victims. To better understand how the murders could have been committed, the prosecution sought the expertise of crime scene reconstructionist and former homicide detective Rod Englert.
So I have to just look at the evidence, let the evidence do the talking, and then find support for that evidence to work out a logical sequence. That's what a reconstructionist does.
7 weeks after the murders, Englert first walked through the crime scene in an attempt to piece together the elements of his reconstruction.
So the first thing that I did was to get a feel for the scene, the dimensions, the space, walk through Nicole's home, upstairs, downstairs, and looking, and you might find this interesting. You know what I was looking for? I don't know what I was looking for. I just know it when I see it. I know what's out of place. because of that experience. Not that I'm cerebral or anything, but you just, you know, having seen these so many times, you just sort of, you recognize when something's not right.
This reconstruction is based on Englert's written report as presented to the court. It speculates how the crime may have occurred and how long it might take, assuming the prosecution's theory that O.J. Simpson was the killer. The defense contended that the murders would have involved a prolonged struggle of as much as 15 minutes. The prosecution, however, believed they took a total of 30 seconds.
The evidence suggests that when Nicole came out of her door, and we're going in slow motion, that she was approached by O.J. Simpson, who hit her on the head numerous times, and then she has 3 stab wounds to the left side of her neck that went very, very deep, and she goes down causing abrasions to her elbow, to her face, from hitting the concrete. Then after she is down on the ground, then Ron Goldman walks up, and when he walks up, an altercation is between the two of them. The glove comes off because O.J. had his left arm around. The glove drops in the scene, and he incapacitates Ron Goldman and then goes back to Nicole and then picks up her hair, cuts her throat from left to right, all the way back to her spine, lowers her head down, and then with the evidence that is on the knife, goes back to and then cuts the throat of Ron Goldman, and then he's bleeding on the bars, and then lays him over on his left side through that process. And this is a position that Goldman was in somewhat. Then he goes back to Nicole, steps on her back. There's a foot impression in this area on her back, and then leaves the scene.
Englert also came up with a theory about how the killer's glove had been left at the crime scene and how O.J. Simpson cut his hand.
That consistent with the glove being removed, this is how this occurrence happened, that during the struggle the glove came off and dropped to the ground. And notice that the knife blade at this point, and stick your finger out, would be parallel to where O.J. Simpson's hand would be, and that could come across and cut this incision that was on his finger. Everything is parallel. There's nothing cross-section to it, and this is consistent with the evidence of a struggle, which can happen.
Prosecutors felt that by cutting his own finger, Simpson had inadvertently left a trail of blood that by itself was highly incriminating. That, plus his motive and lack of an alibi, was quite possibly enough to obtain a conviction. But prosecutors still had mostly circumstantial evidence against him. They would attempt to ice the case through DNA collected from the bloodstains. DNA analysis over the last 2 decades had begun to revolutionize criminal investigations. Until recently, blood evidence had limited use in helping identify criminals. By examining what are called the antigens in blood, scientists could determine its type, A, O, B, or AB, but could not trace a blood sample to any one individual. Beginning in the 1980s, science promised to make blood evidence much more significant by examining its DNA. Found in every cell of our bodies, DNA contains the coded instructions of our being. The color of our eyes, our height and hair color, the size of our brain, and so on. Since no 2 humans are alike, except identical twins, it follows that no 2 people have the same set of DNA instructions. By breaking the code, scientists have been able to identify the patterns or markers that distinguish one person's DNA from another's. 2 tests are used to isolate and identify human DNA. One, called polymerase chain reaction, or PCR, requires a small sample of blood cells, which are then replicated to produce a larger sample. For the other test, called restriction fragment length polymorphism, or RFLP, researchers must start with a much larger sample of cells. Most of the testing in the Simpson case used the simpler PCR test. Though most courts have accepted DNA evidence, there remains some controversy about its reliability and methods. Like critics of fingerprint science 100 years ago, some question whether we have truly broken the code. In addition to that, DNA science is difficult to explain and, for many jurors, hard to understand. The results of DNA analysis in the Simpson case were stunning. A prosecution expert testified that the drops of blood leading away from the murder scene were probably O.J. Simpson's. The odds the blood came from someone else were calculated at 1 in 170 million. Blood found on the back gate at the murder scene was also identified as Simpson's. Here, the odds of it being someone else's were 1 in several billion, greater than the population of the planet. This essentially proved the blood was Simpson's. Simpson's blood was also identified on the Bronco's door panel, dashboard, and near the headlight switch. Simpson told police he'd last driven the Bronco before dark on the day of the murders. Crime scene reconstructionist Rod Englert.
When do you turn on your headlights? Daytime? Not really. So there was a transfer on that dash which was blood consistent with O.J. Simpson's DNA. But even more remarkable was the console between the passenger seat and the driver's seat. And it had numerous transfer patterns. One was a hand pattern on the back far side of the console, on the console between the passenger seat and the console, which you can see distinctive finger marks, a transfer. And then there's another swipe. These transfers belong to, and it was blood consistent with, the DNA of Ron Goldman and Nicole Simpson.
But for the defense, forensic blood spatter expert Herbert Macdonell testified that he was leery of the blood found in the Bronco because it was so minute.
I don't see how anyone could have been in a struggle with Ron Goldman, or for that matter Nicole Brown, where the blood was all over the area and not got much more blood on them than was reportedly on Mr. Simpson or in his Bronco. The Bronco, in my estimation, had less than 1 drop total in that whole vehicle.
Regardless of the blood in the Bronco, prosecution DNA tests had identified the ample blood from both murder victims on the glove found behind Cato Kalin's bungalow. The forensic evidence gathered by the police and prosecution pointed a bloody finger at O.J. Simpson. The defense would point its finger at the police. The defense in the Simpson case would focus its attack on a chain of events beginning in the wee hours of June 13, 1994. Defense attorney Barry Scheck contended that what happened, and what didn't happen, in the 24 hours following the murders was enough to cast doubt on the prosecution's case.
There was a lack of coordinated effort between the criminalists, the detectives, and the medical examiners. And you want to make sure that you keep everybody out of that crime scene until you have looked at it carefully, looking for the unexpected, making sure that you have seen absolutely everything before you allow all kinds of brass and supervisors to walk in and out, and begin to destroy the scene.
The defense set out to prove that evidence gathering went from bad to worse.
Well, the significance of the Simpson case lies in the way that crime scene was handled and its implications for the lab work. And we're talking here about the way that the criminalists on the scene collected the evidence, the way it was initially processed in the laboratories, and the way the medical examiner's office dealt with that.
At the scene of the murders on South Bundy Drive, camera crews arrived at 7:30 a.m. Rod Englert believes the cameras were a distraction that seriously affected the way the crime scene was handled.
It's just really difficult to do your job when just a few feet away you've got 15, 20 cameras over your shoulder that's going to be second guessing you. Well, what are you thinking about? Are you thinking about the evidence while you're down on your hands and knees? Or are you thinking about these people shooting up the back of your dress? You see what I'm saying?
Detective Lang, in charge of the investigation, couldn't stop the crews from filming. But he wanted to shield vital crime scene information so it wouldn't become public knowledge. Lang covered Brown's body with a blanket he found in her house. This would draw criticism at trial.
The bodies, of course, themselves are evidence. Blood patterns on the body are evidence. If you have a camera crew show up and videotape that, you've compromised it, and you can't necessarily use that if you had a potential suspect or a witness that you'd interviewed down the line. The media today has lens that could highlight a human hair at 200 feet. You know, we're just honing in on the crime scene, on the one victim, Nicole Brown, in all of the evidence, compromising that evidence. That's one reason that body was covered.
They took a blanket and they put it over the bodies and they brought hairs and fibers all across that scene, when obviously some of the key pieces of evidence in the case might come down to hairs and fibers. Where did they come from?
Only one of the bodies had been covered, and Lang felt his reason was valid.
Did we contaminate it? There's always that possibility, but in this case it was exactly the right thing to do because there was no contamination. There were no foreign hairs, fibers, or debris found on Nicole Brown or her clothing. It was a tightly knit, clean hospital blanket that was used.
The cameras, meanwhile, became a useful tool for the defense.
We were able to get some of the videotape of the cameras looking in as the officers were processing the crime scene, and able to demonstrate that they weren't changing their gloves, that they were commingling some of the evidence, that people were walking in and out of the crime scene at times when they probably shouldn't have been.
The defense began a theme it would stress throughout the trial, that the blood evidence in the case had been contaminated. When blood is shed, bacteria immediately begins to break it down, along with its DNA. The defense suggested improper handling of the blood swatches had allowed the blood to deteriorate too far to permit accurate test results. Chief criminalist Dennis Fung had relied primarily on swabbing the blood at the murder scene and transferring it to cotton swatches. The swatches were supposed to be dried, then wrapped in cloth bindles for transfer to the lab. But several of the bindles were blood-stained, proving the swatches were wet when placed inside. That could encourage bacterial contamination. Fung also left the blood evidence in his enclosed van for hours without air conditioning in the hot California sun.
And the last thing in the world one should do is put it into a plastic bag and stick it onto a truck, a crime scene truck, and let it bake for 7 hours, because you're going to degrade the DNA there.
That's a terrible mistake from the point of view of a criminalist, isn't it?
Yes.
The theme of contamination was one of the most hotly contested issues at the trial.
Murders do not occur in a sterile lab setting. There was contamination, there always has been. But they would lead you to believe that this somehow affected the outcome of this blood evidence, and the reality of it is it did not. The fact of the matter is, if you're looking strictly at the DNA in this case, you could have collected all of those blood samples and placed them out on Bundy Drive for a month and let the traffic run up and down over them and then collect them. Is that going to contaminate them? Well, sure, it's going to contaminate them. Is that going to change the DNA properties? Is that going to make O.J. Simpson's DNA appear there? No. It's there or it's not there. It's as simple as that.
But Scheck raised another argument, that criminalists at the scene may have commingled some of the blood samples so that no one could say whose blood was whose. Dennis Fung had first collected drops of Simpson's blood at O.J.'s home, then arrived at the murder scene to collect blood samples there. A grueling cross-examination by Barry Scheck raised serious doubts that Fung had changed his gloves, or even worn gloves, while collecting evidence at the murder scene.
And there were some moments during the trial where, I guess the moment that everybody remembers most is that Mr. Fung was picking up that envelope from the scene, and he was claiming that he, of course, did that with his gloves on. All of a sudden, in the courtroom, in a way we'd never even done it before because we had a better video machine in the courtroom, and you could see very, very clearly Dennis Fung grabbing the envelope and touching it without his glove on.
The defense went a step further. It argued that besides the inept collection procedures, more errors were committed when the samples were analyzed. It contended that the handling of the samples in the laboratory was so sloppy that the test results could not be relied upon.
This is a lab that was operating without a protocol, without procedures that people were trained in. Nobody ever taught them how to do it right. That was apparent.
As the defense steadily chipped away at the prosecution's case, another theory began to take shape.
Somebody played with this evidence.
A police conspiracy to frame O.J. Simpson. The mountain of forensic evidence in the Simpson case was turning to rubble. The defense now raised its own theory. Some of the evidence had been planted. The proof began at the gate of Nicole Brown's condominium. According to testimony, the police returned to the murder scene 3 weeks after the murders and found Simpson's blood on the back gate near the bloody shoe prints of the killer. Because it was missed during the initial investigation, the defense suggested it may not have been there at the time of the murder. Detective Tom Lang acknowledges the blood on the gate should have been collected earlier.
Generally at a crime scene, the detective will do a final walkthrough with the criminalists, photography people, latent print people, other detectives who have done canvassing and other things, and they'll walk through, did we do this, did we do that? If that had occurred here, we wouldn't have had the problem with the blood on the rear gate.
During his initial questioning, Simpson consented to giving police a blood sample. The defense suggested someone had planted some of it on the gate. Though presumably exposed to the elements 3 weeks longer, the DNA from the blood on the gate hadn't decomposed as much as the DNA from the blood collected hours after the crime. About the same time Simpson's blood was found on Nicole Brown's gate, Brown's blood was discovered on a pair of socks recovered from Simpson's house the night of the murders. Its significance wasn't missed by the prosecution or the defense. The prosecution's crime scene reconstructionist, Rod Englert, believes the drops of blood were spattered on the socks as Simpson stepped in his ex-wife's blood.
And on the socks we have a projected blood pattern of blood that had to be airborne. When it landed on these socks, creating numerous spots around the ankle and the front of one of them, and numerous match head size spots on the other. Now, I don't know which one was right or left, but those spots stopped at where the shoe would be on, if it was a regular street size shoe. Those spots stopped at a certain level on both of them where pant legs would be. And so when that was analyzed, I remember Tom Lang calling that evening, very excited, and said, "We were right. It was Nicole's blood."
To test his theory on how the blood would have been spattered on Simpson, Englert staged a reenactment. To recreate the struggle, he used police officers dressed in white so the blood would show up better. The white set matched the exact dimensions of the murder scene. The violent struggle between the killer and the second victim, Ronald Goldman, took place in close proximity to the deepening pool of blood from Nicole. Englert matched the amount of blood from the crime scene exactly and found that it would have been difficult to avoid spattering, as the test amply demonstrated. Forensics experts Herbert Macdonell and Henry Lee conducted their own examination of one of the socks found in Simpson's bedroom.
Well, the ankle stain was very large. It was not spatter.
Both men claimed the blood had not been spattered at all.
It was not projected there. It was not dripped there. It was not cast off and landed there by flying through the air. It was transferred from contact by something that had blood on it.
Because the blood on the socks was not found between the fibers, Macdonell concluded it had been wiped across the sock.
The margin around the center of that stain shows blood on the surface of the fibers only. It does not show blood permeating between the fibers. Therefore, we know it's transferred.
Macdonell also found evidence that Simpson's foot was not in the sock when the blood transfer took place. Macdonell uses a shirt sleeve to demonstrate how he thinks the blood was applied to the sock. He places a single drop of blood on top of the cloth, which he calls surface 1. He rubs the blood in, and it soaks onto the back, or surface 2. The blood is then transferred to surface 3, but does not soak through to surface 4. Macdonell and Lee found that blood had seeped through from sides 1 and 2 of Simpson's sock onto side 3, which would have been impossible if Simpson's foot had been inside the sock between surface 2 and surface 3. To the defense, this was compelling evidence the blood could have been planted on the sock, either at the crime scene or while the socks were in police custody. The conspiracy theory was supported by defense experts who found the presence of a substance called EDTA in both the blood on the sock and the blood from the gate at the crime scene. EDTA is a preservative added to blood in a test tube to prevent it from clotting. It's also present naturally in small quantities in the human bloodstream. But witnesses testified that the amount of EDTA in the 2 bloodstains was much higher than normal, suggesting the blood on the gate and the socks came from the lab. Down but not defeated, the prosecution brought out its most dramatic evidence.
We can find the mate to it.
The trial of O.J. Simpson reached a turning point with the pair of gloves. Commingled on them was the blood of both murder victims. According to testimony at trial, one glove was found at the scene of the murders, the other on Simpson's property on Rockingham Drive. But a now infamous courtroom demonstration seriously undermined the evidence. The prosecution team decided to have Simpson try on the gloves in front of the jury. The result was a disaster. The gloves apparently did not fit. The prosecution was forced to scramble for an explanation. A former executive of the company that manufactured the gloves testified that when soaked in blood and allowed to dry, the gloves might shrink 10 to 15%. To see if that was possible, Macdonell tested this theory with an identical pair of gloves.
So I took the gloves that were sent to me and I poured my own blood over these gloves in a controlled condition so I knew exactly how much blood remained on the gloves. They were really wet. The blood was worked into them and then they were allowed to dry.
Prior to the experiment, Macdonell photocopied the glove to document its size. After the bloody glove dried, he again photocopied it for comparison. It had shrunk less than 1%. Next, he wanted to find out how small the glove would become if it really did shrink as much as the manufacturer claimed. He used the photocopier to reduce the glove to 10 and 15% of its original size. Then he compared the reductions to the original photocopy. the change was enormous. At 15%, the gloves would have shrunk over 1.5 inches. In Macdonell's opinion, the change was too drastic. Since it seemed unlikely that the gloves belonged to Simpson, the defense had an opening to expand its theory of a police conspiracy. It had already suggested that someone had planted blood on the back gate at the murder scene and on the socks from Simpson's bedroom. Now it put forward the theory that the glove found on Simpson's property had also been deliberately planted. Mark Fuhrman had been alone when he found the glove at Simpson's house. He'd also been among the first detectives to arrive at Brown's condominium, where the first glove had been found. The defense suggested that Fuhrman had picked up the second glove at the scene of the murders, taken it with him to Simpson's estate, and planted it on the pathway behind Cato Kalin's bungalow. For LAPD Detective Lang, it would have been impossible for Fuhrman to have found the second glove at the scene of the murders because he was the 13th detective to sign the log.
Because 12 people there before Fuhrman only saw one glove. And it's very logical the way Fuhrman found the glove. He was doing what anybody should have done, following up on an interview with Cato Kalin.
Taking its theory a step further, the defense suggested that before he planted the glove, Fuhrman may have used it to smear the blood of the victims inside Simpson's Bronco. It was a claim that made the LAPD's blood boil.
Mark Fuhrman did not plant any blood. Absolutely. He did not do it. He would have no knowledge how to do that. And there's no evidence of that whatsoever. None. There was no sprinkling of blood in that Bronco whatsoever. There weren't any drops. That was all transfers. And the significance of it was that it was transferred in the patterns consistent with one who had blood on his hands or possible clothing to get in and open the door, open the interior door, turn on the lights, touch over here with a hand transfer, and if implements or something was placed on the seat to be able to do that, someone would have to be so knowledgeable and so cerebral about predicting what was going to happen that I don't have that capability. I don't know anybody that does to be able to make it consistent. And then to do it on the socks at the house, impossible.
The defense had no real evidence that the glove was planted, and at first it could provide no motive for Fuhrman to plant it. But that soon changed.
You say on your oath that you have not addressed any black person as a nigger or spoken about black people as niggers in the past 10 years, Detective Fuhrman.
That's what I'm saying, sir.
So that anyone who comes to this court and quotes you as using that word in dealing with African Americans would be a liar, would they not, Detective Fuhrman?
Yes, they would.
All of them, correct?
All of them.
In one of the trial's most dramatic moments, the defense introduced evidence that Fuhrman had expressed hatred toward blacks. The defense had found its final weapon for casting doubt on the prosecution's case. It played the race card. Tom Lang feels the issue of race was irrelevant.
Fuhrman's racism or whatever else Fuhrman is has nothing to do with the two people getting murdered. It's unfortunate he was in the middle of it for the first couple hours, but you have to deal with that. And if you think he's planted evidence or anything else, we need to see evidence of that.
Case number BA097211.
The prosecution had been so certain of its forensic evidence, it had withheld other evidence pointing to Simpson's guilt for fear of exhausting the jury's patience.
A felony upon Nicole Brown Simpson.
But the defense had effectively nullified each piece it presented, claiming it had been contaminated by sloppy handling and a disregard for the procedures established to protect it. On October 3rd, 1995, Orenthal James Simpson was found not guilty of the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman. Tom Lang is convinced the jury disregarded the compelling evidence the prosecution had put forward.
Prosecution proved their case beyond a reasonable doubt. I've never seen so much evidence. Even there was a tremendous amount of evidence they didn't put on, but there was a tremendous amount they did. I've never seen that much put on in a case. When a jury comes back in 2.5 hours, it's pretty evident they didn't do what they were instructed to do, regardless of the outcome, regardless if it's guilty or not guilty. They did not do what they were told to do, and the court did not follow up on that.
Defense attorney Barry Scheck feels the jury's verdict was based squarely on reasonable doubt. He believes the way the LAPD handled the evidence was totally inadequate.
People in the forensic community recognized that this was wrong, that these procedures were unacceptable. The more sophisticated the technology, the more powerful the forensic evidence, the greater the importance that these people develop and are able to maintain a high sense of independence and professionalism. That kind of laboratory is the kind of laboratory and the kind of crime scene people that are our best protection for convicting the truly guilty and exonerating the truly innocent.
After Simpson's acquittal, lawyers representing the victims' families in a civil suit would learn from the mistakes of the criminal trial. They would bring in circumstantial evidence not presented earlier, such as the fact that Simpson owned a pair of the expensive Bruno Magli shoes like those that left their imprint at the scene of the crime. The prosecution only had to convince a majority of the jurors beyond a 50% certainty that Simpson was guilty. The prosecution was successful, and O.J. Simpson was found liable for the deaths of Ronald Goldman and Nicole Brown. He was required to pay $33.5 million to the victims' families. During the criminal trial, the prosecution had what it believed to be irrefutable evidence. It was wrong. Careless handling and collection techniques robbed the evidence of its power. It served only to raise doubt. The aftermath of the Simpson trial resonated throughout the halls of science. Forensics itself was put on the stand, and it became clear that the most reliable witness can also be the most easily compromised.